name is Michael Scillia. I'm on the NIBA board, and I have a few housekeeping announcements to make. If I can have your attention for a few minutes. Thank you. First of all, thank you for coming. It was a great conference. We have over 89 investment banks, merchant banks, and lenders and funds here today for our 20 presenting companies. So we are very pleased. Of course, we have our normal contingent of attorneys and accountants and other service providers. So we thank you very much for making this a great conference. In the way of housekeeping, first the fun item. Some of you remember a couple of years ago when we were in Florida, we did a successful poker tournament when we were at the Seminole Casino. They wanted a bigger guarantee here, the bigger places maybe, so we didn't play them on ahead of time because we didn't want to put this guarantee. We do need 20 players, but if you are interested in playing poker in the second NIBA tournament this evening, please let me know that. I'll be around. I see one over here. He's obviously, I see. We need 20 minimum to have a good tournament. And timing-wise, we're going to do it after you've had a chance to go out to dinner after the cocktail party. So we'll leave probably around 9:30. We want to run the tournament will probably start about 9:45. We'll give you all a chance to eat dinner after the cocktail party. That gives you 2.5 hours. To go to the restaurants here. It's a small buy-in, $100 buy-in. There will be a rebuy, 20-minute sessions after. I'd also like to update you on the Board of Directors, legislative and regulatory comments that we've been in Washington twice now. If you recall from the New York session, I visited the SEC both in September and October on 2 different issues. One issue was the very important 153-page revisions the SEC is making for broker-dealers and issuers on financial responsibility and net capital. I'm pleased to say that the director of the Trading and Markets Division of the SEC actually met with us for 3.5 hours, and we were able to get 3 major amendments bypassed, and they are now going to be working with Fugler to reduce the gravity of response to small broker dealers on those 3 issues. We'll story that more in the near future. The second meeting in October we had with them involved the changes to Regulation A. As you know, when they stopped using SP2s back in 2005, the short-form registration statement, the number of operators between 1992, when they first came out, and 2005 dropped like that. Both the number of operators and the number of monies raised is all issues. Reg A, we have proposed that Reg A have a second form, which would be a short-form registration form. We went to the New York Stock Exchange market department, which lists the OTC stocks in the New York Stock Exchange market. We went to the NASDAQ market. Most of them want to increase listings. They are very much in favor of our initiatives with the SEC to get them to take not just a $50 million increase, but actually to reform this type. We don't know if that's going to go on, but we're in there. We've been invited back in February. They're on a very long-term scale to get that done. And the final thing is, I need some volunteers of broker-dealers that work in the small cap area and are familiar with companies or their companies that they're representing to potentially act as consultants to FINRA on a paid basis. For the first time in my career, FINRA is considering hiring 7 to 10 broker-dealers on a part-time basis to consult with them to fix the 6490 problem. 6490, for those of you who may not remember, is the rule that asks public companies to file with FINRA where they take any material corporate action. It has been disaster for 2 years. We were asked to come up with 100 companies and 10 broker-dealers, not members of NIBA, so we were coming to the company because they asked us not to use the number. And of the 100 companies we looked at that FINRA had approved, 77 out of 100 failed the test that the broker-dealer would have asked, even though FINRA approved it. And 23 didn't have enough information that even FINRA could have found out whether to approve it. Yes, they did. When we presented FINRA back with those results, FINRA agreed that something had to be done when 100 out of 100 on a sample would have been not passed by broker-dealers, and yet FINRA passed each one. So it's in shambles. FINRA is considering hiring as consultants broker-dealers that come in and tell them how to fix the problem. So anybody who would like to work on that panel, potentially be hired in a consulting capacity to FINRA, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Okay, how's the body? Can people hear me in the back? Can you hear me back there? We're good. They wanted to do some adjusting. All right, we're in good shape. So, I want to introduce to you our speaker for lunch today, Michael Morford. Michael we saw a little bit earlier, but he is an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, which means you can hit him up for your charities. He's a military veteran and a transitioning, I like to call him a transitioning, or we could say former, Wall Street executive. During his 15-year career in Wall Street, he was considered one of the leading institutional equity research salesmen covering the oil and gas industry on Wall Street. His career in the investment banking community focused on Oklahoma and Texas regions that involved stocks with boutique energy investment banks, large international banks. During his tenure, he focused exclusively on oil and gas sector of the U.S. economy. This included maintaining a deep technical understanding of upstream energy practices, a constant discourse with executives of both exploration and production companies, as well as oil field service companies, a daily dialogue with the Southwest region's many mutual and pension funds regarding portfolio weightings of energy stocks. Michael is involved in over 34 IPOs and oil and gas related companies to include Continental Resources, Bronco Drilling, Pioneer Drilling. He is one of the most respected authorities on Wall Street regarding nuclear energy and is the personal advisor on oil and natural gas matters to the executive director of Truman National Security Project, a nonpartisan Washington, D.C. think tank focused on national security and energy policy.
Michael has some other interesting facts about him that I want to share. He is a former U.S. Army captain and an Iraq War veteran. Here's the good part. A two-time Louisiana U.S. Army Reserve Commander Grade Officer of the Year and a 2000 MacArthur Leadership Award recipient presented by the Chief of Staff of the Army. He has a B.S. in Engineering, a Master's in Business, both from Tulane University in Louisiana. He currently is pursuing his Ph.D. in Foreign Policy and resides in Frisco, Texas with his wife Megan and their daughter Ava. Would you welcome Michael? He's going to talk to you about the macro application of energy, and he's going to be around for Q&A.
Thank you, Michael. Obviously, when I spoke about NIBA earlier, it was pretty light and fast. Probably glazed over a lot of subject matter, and I was very honored when Michael and the members of the NIBA board asked if I could talk about the macro perspectives on the oil and gas sector, especially post-election. This is a subject matter that I focused on basically my entire career, so being a true nerd, I just love the subject matter. No offense to healthcare or retail consumer electronics, I just love talking oil and gas. I don't really have a set agenda for the discussion. What I'd like to do is just give a few talking points, and what I find is the better content and concepts come out in the Q&A, I feel very comfortable being able to field a number of questions. So if there's something random you've always wanted to ask, we'd love to be able to answer it for you. This week, ironically, and I don't know how many people caught this, but the EIA issued a report that by 2030, the United States will be the largest producer of oil. And I'll repeat that again, by 2030, the U.S. will be the largest producer of oil. I don't think people appreciate that. Even in the election cycle, people did not appreciate that. But it just goes to show the transformative nature of the hydraulic shale fracturing with the horizontal drilling technique. It's something that first started years ago, underbalanced drilling, horizontally, it's not new. But when they finally cracked the code in the Barnett Shale in 2003 with a fellow named Mitchell, that's when it finally broke open the opportunity for the U.S. to go back in and extract hydrocarbons that we used to know were there that thought forever were unrecoverable. Shale is a source rock. If you haven't heard this real quick overview, it's basically where the oil or gas was formed. It's the matter in which was basically the ocean when it got carried over layer after layer, and under time, pressure, and heat, the kerogen, the organic matter, was slowly baked. And so as it switched from a kerogen, it then became a very, very raw crude oil. And if you go deeper and hotter, it will bake further to the point where it will become a natural gas. So if you've ever been confused about the natural gas versus crude oil and how you get it, that's the quick and dirty. You're almost going to always find a form of crude and a form of natural gas in the exact same well because it's the same hydrocarbon. It's a function of how long it takes. This stuff is impermeable. You can't get, if you've ever seen a shale, I should have brought my piece of shale, it's as solid as this wooden table. But with hydraulic fracturing, you can effectively crack it open and fissures, hair thick fissures, finally create pathways for these molecular items to travel and traverse out of where they've been locked for so long. The pressures are tremendous, and it's just the magic slickwater fracking key that we finally figured out in 2003. Since then, it has been a renaissance. It's been the most amazing thing I've seen in my career, and I've been through a lot of ups and downs, even though I've only been in Wall Street for 15 years. I grew up on a cattle farm in Oklahoma where there's a lot of these things going up and down, and they've stopped going up and down around 8 to 16 and collapse of oil prices. It's truly amazing to finally go after all these hydrocarbons. And for those of you who do not know, the United States is equivalent to Saudi Arabia in terms of natural gas. In terms of the oil, if we look at the shale, we're about number 2 in terms of global reserves. And so that's why it's not a stretch for the EIA to argue that by 2030, we are going to be the largest producer of crude oil. It's because it's there, it's always been there, we've just never had a way to get it. Now we do, and it does not matter what political opinions there are, what regulatory attempts have been made, as long as you have crude oil that is at a high enough level to make this costly effort economic, you will continue to see this happen. It is a runaway freight train, and it's a function of just getting to be a part of it. That's pretty cool. That's kind of the big picture on the shales and why we're seeing something we've never seen before. One final footnote on that, I don't know if you've heard of the phrase peak oil. I think that needs to start to become a part of our former vernacular. We need to stop using it because ever since around 2008, we started to see an uptick in our domestic onshore crude oil production. And so Hubert's peak, which was created in the 70s, which was a brilliant, absolutely accurate fundamental scientific analysis of the ability to produce crude, which held true and took us down a cliff. It's gone. So I would argue that if you hear people talk about peak oil, if you hear people talk about those politicians just need to let us drill more, that's probably a lesser informed opinion because the oil and gas industry has moved on without the government, and that's why this thing is going to work. So it's very exciting. At the end of the day, though, that doesn't solve all your cures. I'm someone who considers myself very centrist, but I'm also a big believer in being stewards of our earth. And there's no way around the unhealthy nature of what crude oil is. So natural gas we do need to consider as the bridge fuel, but we also need to continue to think about the longer term, cleaner alternatives. This is not saying clean coal, that's not going to be, at the end of the day, burning a hydrocarbon, and human amounts to scrub it. You're never going to be able to get the solutions out of solar or wind. Those are by default not stable enough baseline to provide sustainable electricity. I firmly believe that the ultimate long-term solution, this may be the only guy in the room that will say this, but it actually still remains nuclear. Believe it or not, there's never been one direct death in the United States as a result of a nuclear catastrophe. We all are very familiar with 3 Mile Island. That happened in '79. We still think about it as a massive scare. Not one person died. Yet you have basically a death a day in the oil and gas industry, but because it happens all over the place, and it's kind of happens on the radar screen, with individuals who are, lower end laborers, you don't hear it in the news. So it's not, I'm not trying to sugarcoat the oil and gas industry. It remains dirty, and it remains a very intensive and dangerous industry. And if we want to talk about energy policy and national security, then you do have to re-inject nuclear discussion back into the conversation. It was unfortunate the Fukushima disaster in Japan after the tsunami, because that scared the living daylights out of everybody. But you had an 80, 30-year-old infrastructure. It was just a massive set of errors that caused that. And I would hope that as we start to get refocused on running our country and we're past the election cycle, you start to hear cooler heads that are thoughtful and educated on the subject matter bring it back up. Natural gas, crude oil pricing. Let's touch on those real quick. Crude oil pricing remains very stable, $85, $90 a barrel at the low end. I don't foresee that being a problem. I believe that even if we see dips and you see the stock market retrace and people freak out because crude may collapse down to $75 a barrel, that's not something to worry about. Continue to look at the long-term trends. It's all about global supply, global demand. What we have finally started to accept is from the oil crisis of '73 until about 2002, we had overbuilt the global capacity for refining. And so the multi-generations of cheap gasoline that we were driving around was not a function of the supply, it was a function of just how much refining capacity. But we finally caught up. Production finally caught up with the refining capacity, and demand caught up, and now we will forever be in a very tight window. So that is why I'm not worried about crude ever collapsing down below economic levels. I would hope we don't see sustained $150 crude, but I do think that as a global economy, we have adjusted to this higher platform on crude pricing. Natural gas is a very different thing. Most of us have heard about how cheap natural gas is, and it's very uneconomic in some wells. If you're talking a very dry gas well where there's not condensates and other liquids that you can strip out, it's virtually uneconomic to drill a natural gas well in the United States right now. That's probably going to stay that way for a while. I'm not trying to sit here and make predictions on how to trade the natural gas cycle or try to sit and talk about wanting to buy low, sell high, and jump on some stock. But we are going to be in a long-term trend on pretty depressed natural gas pricing purely because this marvelous technology of fracking and horizontal drilling has unlocked the ability to get gas so quickly, and it's so prodigious because, like I said, we are sitting on Saudi Arabian natural gas that we just got a hold of it a lot faster than we ever think we could. So I believe, and I know that the industry still believes in the long-term opportunities that natural gas presents as a bridge fuel for the 22nd century of economic or electric baseline power. And in a way, the longer you have sub $354 MCF gas, the better it is. It may not sound fun, but allows the industries to start to bring production and manufacturing back into the U.S. because they now have cheap energy sources in the form of using natural gas for the electric generation. So those are some of the big picture things that I think that we continue to look at from Wall Street. The noise that you see from day to day is just that, it's noise. And I think that the three things that I've touched on that I would continue to reiterate is expect cheap gas for a while, but that's not a bad thing. Expect expensive crude oil for quite a while, but that's not a bad thing. The U.S. is continuing on its path, and we will become near energy independent. At the very least, we may get to the point where we're just North America independent, and that's not too bad either. So that's the brief remarks. I actually would much prefer to open up to Q&A because that's where we tend to get some more interesting dialogue. So if anyone has any questions, fire away. Go ahead.
Quick comment and question. Comment is, I agree with you. Good power things that we're going to have to get rid of the economy can't sustain itself if gas prices start to go down. question is that there's a lot of lobbying going on in Congress right now to try to, push this clean energy, wind, solar,
Right.
and other types of energy. The thing is, I saw a chart in front of me, mapped out, the functional usage of each energy component, one of which, oil and gas combustion engines. The thing that people are missing is the fact that wind power never replaced gas.
Right.
And so, can you speak to that a little bit about how there seems to be a disconnect between
DC and the rest of the world. So the question is basically, there's okay.
I'm just going to say, if you don't mind, if it's not inconvenient to you, when you ask a question, if you can stand up, because people can't hear you, and if you don't mind,
Repeat it. Yeah, the question is basically these alternative, cleaner technologies such as solar and wind. Why does the Beltway machine of Washington, D.C. continue to promote and push that form of energy and not something like natural gas-powered fuel vehicles? The answer is at the end of the day, a lot of that's rhetoric. The Truman National Security Project, which I advise to, is a bunch of Beltway insiders who have the director of the Department of Energy as well as the White House on these issues, and they know that gets votes. But at the end of the day, and they will continue to send money that way, but if you look at it on a percent basis of the dollars committed towards future energy solutions, it's actually not that much money. So even if it's stayed flatline towards promoting solar and wind, fine. It's actually not that much money. I think that the administration, they actually got a pretty bad rap in the last couple of years of being anti-oil and gas, and I would argue that they're trying to be pragmatic oil and gas. They actually do and have started to really understand just how opportunistic natural gas creates for our nation to become less dependent on crude oil. And a little factoid, you could actually convert 1,000 oil and gas or gasoline stations along your major interstate systems, and your entire U.S. trucking fleet convert to natural gas. That's all it takes. So the infrastructure build out would be massive to run cars completely on natural gas, but you can get there pretty quickly. Oh, to convert our entire fleet, or you need 1,000 gas? Yeah, to convert our 1,000 gasoline, it's actually starting to happen now. Cummins, the engine maker, your Mack trucks, if you go to the Mid-American Truck Show in Louisville, Kentucky, which is it's the biggest event for that industry, they're actually already partnering with some of the largest natural gas producers to start to make the modular elements to put onto gasoline engines so they can run on natural gas. If you go to Tulsa, which, believe it or not, is one of the MLP capitals of the world. We have Williams Company, one of some of the largest pipeline companies in the world in Tulsa. They actually are sitting on some of the most natural gas in the U.S. That's where a lot of these conversations are happening. So the industry, now that the natural gas is cheap enough, is starting to progress forward without even waiting for any grant money or support from the government. So I actually would not be surprised to see these 1,000 so-called, Goldilocks located gasoline stations to be adding the CNG within the next 4 to 5 years. I think we're getting that close. If you listen to the conference calls over the last 2 quarters from the Cummins engines, Navistar, it's becoming a bigger and bigger element to their forward-looking operations.
When would you predict, if at all, what year would it be that the U.S. would again become self-sufficient in energy?
I can hear that pretty easily, but just in case you didn't hear over there, when do I think the U.S. could become self-sufficient again on energy? My guess is never. I think the more important question isn't if we can become completely self-sufficient on energy, it is can we become enough efficient to completely disregard the Middle East? Because at the end of the day, it's all about national security. And go ahead.
Thanks. That was my second question. The answer to the first one was no.
Okay, yes. So at the end of the day, the way at least I look at the world through the prism is what will it take for us to be a safer nation? And I think there's really no way out of it. It's how quickly can we divorce ourselves from our dependence on Middle East hydrocarbons. And that day, I do think the EIA is pretty accurate. I think if we continue on just the pace we are now with the active land drilling program in the U.S., 2030 is not an unrealistic date. That sounds like a long way away, but what is that, 18 years? I've got a 2-year-old, so it feels like tomorrow with me. Actually, right here, he had a question first.
A little bit on nuclear energy. I've been reading a lot about uranium mining and production, which seems to be really lagging in projections. America has quite a substantial uranium mining business. One of the few places in the world that does so. My question is, considering what's going on with San Onofre and San Clemente, which I live about 25 miles away from, it's currently shut down 3 million homes a year. The projections out of Europe, Asia, China are off the charts for nuclear plant production. Why is the natural resource market lagging behind those productions? What kind of projections?
On the uranium side? Yeah, so if you didn't hear the question, you basically focused on uranium mining, which is such a very different element to the nuclear technology build-out, and why is it lagging behind? I don't know if I'll be able to answer that very well. Before I start on that, don't let me forget to say the word thorium. And if you haven't read about thorium, I would. It actually was the first chosen naturally radioactive molecular molecule to be used for nuclear power. It's actually a safer, better, naturally occurring radioactive isotope than, because uranium is not radioactive naturally underground, other than normal levels. You have to process it, refine it. Thorium, you could actually just shove it, not quite, but almost shove it right into a reactor. The reason they didn't use it is it's such a natural burn rate, its half-life are so predictable that they can't elevate or de-elevate the level of the radioactive level. And man loves to control things, and so we thought, screw that. You know, uranium may be riskier, but we can control how much we get the rods in. To your question about uranium mining, it has been very slow. Part of it has been the permitting process by the Bureau of Land Management. That is, you cannot imagine the length of time it takes to go from identifying a potential mine in the United States for uranium mining to actually extracting. I'm guessing 25 to 30 years. It is beyond red tape, and that's an unfortunate reality. The good news is that if you look at the price, the spot price of uranium on the commodities market, it actually has been a pretty moderately priced commodity. And that's because there was enough of a backlog that had already been mined and some of the existing mines that could reopen. So I would say, instead of questioning why policymakers haven't been pushing for more uranium mining domestically, it purely becomes a supply-demand function. The moment you get uranium back above levels for new mines to unshutter, you will start to see some new uranium mining activities. And I'm a big fan of uranium in terms of long-term commodity. I don't want to say speculation, but I'm a big believer in wanting to have exposure if I'm looking at a diversified portfolio into uranium specifically. Big fan of that. I know I didn't completely answer the question, but hopefully I kind of.
Well, the lag time between production of these nuclear power plants is 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
So I guess there's a disconnect between the amount of.
Oh, there's going to be a coming wave of need. We clearly aren't mining it for what will be this big wave. Yeah, because even with the Fukushima event, if you look at China, India, Europe, and most of the other developed nations, or even continents, they are continuing to progress along with a massive backlog of new 4th generation nuclear infrastructure. China is going to soon become, right now they're considered the dirtiest industrial country in the world. They are on pace to become the cleanest. They are looking to, they have like 100-year planning strategies. So they are staying on track, and that tidal wave earthquake did not stop them at all from their build out. So yes, there could be a point in which, and this is the way it always happens, you will probably not see the mining of uranium pick up until the price spikes so fast that then it's everyone's catching up, and shame on them for not being a little more proactive. But unfortunately, money's money, and money talks, and people aren't that fortunate in the U.S. at least. Right behind you, sir.
Given the history of regulatory prevention from the expansion of nuclear plants, and the current environment where in many states now the policies are growing against allowing fracking. How do you come to the conclusion that regulatory situations won't matter in the expansion of the fracking industry?
Oh, the fracking industry.
Yeah.
That is purely isolated to the Marcellus Shale Basin. Montana, North Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico. There's no regulatory impediments. And the fracking issue isn't a whole lot of work, especially when you get east of the Mississippi River. It has been for a couple of years. That's actually, not that I'm trying to put a plug back in for Nemaha Water, but that's what drew me to Nemaha Water, was because the more I learned about disposal water, the more I realized that fracking is not the issue. The disposal water is the environmental risk. And I'm drawn to that because I believe that it's an industry that needs lead, and it's an industry that needs to be stewards of themselves. And I'm much more concerned about the disposal water side than the fracking. The fracking obviously has a lot of moratoriums in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. I don't want to sit and sound polarizing or stand and sound polarizing, but I think that that's a large uninformed set of state lawmakers. And I believe when they understand, they actually, let me backtrack. So I go to DC about 2.5 years ago. The True National Security Project that gave just had 5 slides. It was like, this is oil, it comes on the ground, you know, it's black. And when I was done, they were applauding me like I had just read a Nobel laureate's writing. And they said, no one's ever explained this to us before. And I suddenly realized that, talk about the blind leading the blind. But these guys advise the policymakers, and the policymakers lean on them to know what they're talking about. And it was unbelievable. And that's why I believe it's just a function of patient education. ANGA, American North Natural Gas Association, actually Aubrey McClendon from Chesapeake out of Oklahoma is really who spearheaded ANGA. They were a pretty new entity, circa 2008. They've been doing a very good job of educating. I think that that's the most important thing, to educate policymakers. And if they started to realize that hydraulic fracturing is not new, it's been going on 70 years, it's just never been done at the size, the scope, the length of the lateral, the amount of water. I mean, there's issues you got to address, but it's not causing earthquakes. There may be some tremors that are related to the oil and gas industry, but it ain't from fracking, just because of the depth you're going down. There's yet to be any conclusive evidence to that. So hopefully, over time, as education and politics just get overrun by facts, that it will lead. So I'm not as worried about it, and that's why I'm not trying to dismiss your question, but I'm not as worried about it.
Michael, given the new Congress, for at least the next 2 years until the next congressional election, what is your feeling about the potential opening up of some of the Northfield pipeline?
Oh, yeah, with, why am I going blank? What's that pipeline called? Keystone. The funny thing about Keystone is it's already being built. The important part of Keystone. The Keystone pipeline was designed to go from Canada all the way down to the Gulf shores in Texas. The part that was being objected to, and the reason that the White House and the administration had the authority to stop it, was because it was crossing an international border. But that was to just bring heavy oil sands into the U.S. Canada's already gotten their own solution. They're already sending them west, and that's fine. I really don't care if oil sands come into the U.S. The important part of it is getting the oil from Cushing, which is the hub of all crude oil, and that's where WTI pricing is based in Oklahoma, down to the Gulf. That's the key element, and that's already been built. It was already approved, the right-of-way, so it was, for me, a very comical sight to watch the political and media sensation about Keystone when it had nothing. The people building the pipe kept on building the pipe, and I don't care if they ever build a part of that. So I don't think it will resurface. If you were talking, over drinks at a bar in DC, the liberal and conservative will admit that they both were using it as a political tool, and now no one cares. And the Northfields, that's a good question. I don't have an opinion on that. And it's because I think you really are dealing with a prolonged fight. I think that the proliferation of lower 48 domestic drilling is going to, over time, dissipate the need or the belief on the operators to do that. I would totally segue, but that just makes me think that I think that the larger multinationals, BP, Exxon, Shell, they're the ones who are pushing for it. The real opportunity is the Arctic Circle. And that's another subject matter that is not getting much press, and I'm already starting to work with the Securities Project on co-authoring a publication about that. Because as we have global warming, and I'm not trying to be political, but there's global warming, ice is melting, we're going to get a chance to go into the Arctic Circle for the first time ever, and they believe that there's as much oil in the Arctic Circle as there is in Saudi Arabia or the U.S. So think about the political battle over who has the rights to that. I mean, who does? And I think that the North Shore drilling will be completely run over as policymakers and national security advisors start to say, man, that's what the next big offshore resource is, and there are so many national security implications here, we don't have time to deal with the Alaska slope. So,
Thank you.
into that.
What would you think of a increased 25 or 50 cents in the federal gasoline tax?
Question on the federal gasoline tax, do I have an opinion on it? You know, we are the only country, well, I guess I should talk about the Middle East. They have their own pricing for their for their gasoline for the cars, and it has nothing to do with economics. But Europe, Japan, they've all been adding taxes on gasoline forever. And I don't have an opinion, because I don't think that there's been any good economic work done on what the impact would do to the economy. I don't have a problem with it, per se. I think that it's only reasonable to leave it on the table. But I just don't have an opinion, because if we want to get into discussions of regressive taxes versus unregressive taxes, that lies, and I'm not that guy. I'm not that smart.
Yeah, I'm going to show my ignorance here, but I'm old enough. Does, with technology, fracking and going horizontal, does it obviate the need for continued permitting?
Yes, big question. Right.
A lot of people don't know about horizontal drilling.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering.
That's a good question. Those charts where it's oh, I'm sorry. The question is does this new world of horizontal drilling and fracking technology onshore alleviate the need for new permitting offshore government waters? Which is a great question, and I don't think it's being. Those are two fights that are occurring, but the two fights aren't being in the same argument, and they should be, because they are related. And if you look at those charts where it shows nuclear provides so much power, onshore gas, and they layer upon each other, if you look at what's called unconventional oil, which is what fracking is, it's just starting to explode on the chart. I do believe over time we will alleviate the need to go offshore at all. Any of us who were in the oil and gas industry in the mid-90s, that's all you focused on was offshore. Texas was dead, Oklahoma was dead, drilling for oil on land was dead, you were full, and you were finding 3 TCF natural gas deposits right offshore Gulf of Mexico, and it was $100 million drilling projects and $1 billion opportunities. And now they've de-risked the U.S. onshore. So from a risk perspective, if I'm the operator, why would I even want to go offshore even if I could? I don't have the answer to that. I believe over time we will alleviate the fact. I also believe that there's a lot of lack of understanding on MMS acreage, Mineral Management Service acreage offshore, because most of that's already been permitted. It's really a function of the oil and gas operator choosing or choosing not to actually drill on it. So you've got almost all the Gulf of Mexico, even what's called deep shelf and the ultra deep water, leased up. And yet every time there's a new section that comes up for permitting, there seems to be a new fight about it, and yet we're only talking about, it's on the margins, 5% of the acres to drill offshore. If you want to not let new permitting, fine. We've got so many undrilled wells offshore, you have 50 years of offshore drilling left that's already permitted. So I think the fight should end. And I'm not trying to say that the environmental groups aren't informed, but I think that they're not thinking about this logically on that subject. And that, and conversely, I don't think that the large operators are either. I think that they both ought to stop letting their egos get in the way and just realizing I got so many fish to fry, I might as well just get busy, living instead of get busy dying in this fight.
Can I add to that question?
Sure.
I actually own leases in Bakersfield. I've been a family for years, and I'm wondering about that area.
Yeah.
As it applies to taxable areas, individual taxable units, i.e. a lease that can be abated.
No. You're fine. If you've got mineral rights, even if they drill underneath you, they have to pay. You're good. Yes. I'm not.
One question and then I'll wrap it up. I appreciate it. You mentioned Cushing.
Yes.
Did you see the article last week email that indicated that he who could figure out how to get the oil out of Cushing was going to be in the bonanza benefit? And I was amazed. I don't know if you remember the numbers, 45 billion. 45 billion. Briefly touched on, I just saw that article. So if you mentioned the Keystone, how else can you get it out? What's it doing sitting there? How can you get it out? Who's going to have the right to
Yeah, your only options. The question is about Cushing Oil.
What is it?
Cushing is a small town in eastern Oklahoma, not far between south of Tulsa and Oklahoma City. And yet, if you flew over in a small plane, it would look like a sea of massive black swimming pools. And it is billions upon billions of oil. And all of the stuff from all over the U.S. is piped or through train or truck is brought there, and that's where it's kind of sold before it goes on to refinery. And a massive amount of the refining capacity in the U.S. is along the Gulf Shore. If it's not goes to Cushing, it's because it's already close enough to the refining that you can get sent there directly, or it's further north where it's closer to some of the other pad locations where there's some existing refining capacity. But for the most part, just for the purpose of this conversation, assuming that's where all the oil goes, is Cushing. That is one of the big issues, is how do you get the oil out of Cushing to the refiners? There's no easy solution. You either build more pipes down to the Louisiana, Texas coastline, you either build refineries right there, or you start building pipelines up to the other refining, large refining capacities. Some of them are up towards Minnesota, Chicago area. Some of them are out west, believe it or not. It's going to be a 20-year fight to overcome the constraint on takeaway capacity. And there's just no easy way around it. So, sorry. I appreciate the time.